Hello everybody, it's the Alco Diesel Guy with a mystery box, and as we open it we shall see that inside the box is a Lionel train set, specifically the Lionel Christmas Express train set. This is yet another HO scale product from Lionel, aiming to capitalize on its strongest part of its business, which of course is Christmas time, and the traditional time of the train around the Christmas tree. Although of course you can certainly put a train around the menorah too, or whatever religious item you have for your celebrations of holidays. One could certainly consider model railroading and trains alike as a multicultural slash multi-religional activity. Once I cut away the plastic, it reveals a very high gloss box that is designed to catch the eye. Again, Lionel appears to be banking on tradition here, as these models were originally designed way back in the day, obviously, to catch the eye of store patrons as they were bought in shops. Unfortunately, these days, more and more of this retail in general in the United States has gone to online. Still, it's nice to see that Lionel continues to keep its traditions alive and has not forgotten where it's come from. Like most Lionel products, this is a double box train set. I carefully lift the top of the double box to reveal the contents inside. The side panel description of what is contained inside the box specifically. Feel free to pause this and read in detail as to what it has, but the basic set itself consists of the Berkshire locomotive, like most Lionel HO scaled sets these days, which is DCC and sound equipped as well as Bluetooth equipped from the factory. It will respond to commands for both sound and function from either an app from the App Store of either Android or iOS, the actual Bluetooth controller included with the set, and or a DCC controller from a train set layout. 3 very flamboyantly painted coaches with silhouettes on the windows, Christmas themed of course, as well as the Bluetooth controller. I would also like to take this opportunity to point out that, yet again, this train set is designed for people 14 years and older. It is not a toy. The set also features a 41 by 59 inch loop of Magnalock track. The coaches are flicker free and lit by LEDs, and feature metal wheels, as well as metal sprung knuckle couplers. Now let's take a good close-up look at all the equipment we get with this lovely train set. As is typical and as is sort of expected with a model of this quality and or train set of this quality, the packaging is very well done. Everything arrived very securely in terms of the equipment. The same could be said for the tracks. Inside the track and accessories portion of this set, we have the obligatory instruction manual. We also have our track power connection, which is in fact just a wall transformer that plugs directly into the track. More on how that works later. We also have this strange hole in the middle of the actual packaging itself. Now, the more observant of you probably know what the set is all about. For the rest, I'll explain it. What we have here is a knockoff of the Polar Express. Well, perhaps knockoff is kind of harsh, especially considering that the Polar Express is officially licensed and produced by Lionel. I'd rather refer to this as something called platform engineering. Essentially the same locomotives, the same controller, the same tracks, all put into the same package, but repainted and marketed as something slightly different. Kind of like what GM did with Buick, Pontiac, and Oldsmobile, as well as a few of its other brands, and still does to this day, except now making them look a little bit more distinctive. Now let's take a good look at the rolling stock included with this set, and we'll start off with the locomotive. It's a 284 Berkshire type locomotive. That is to say, 2 wheels guiding underneath the pilot to get the locomotive into the curves, 8 wheels driving or propelling it, and 4 supporting the firebox. Now this locomotive, especially to you current Lionel train set owners, looks very, very familiar. It should. The reason for this is that this particular locomotive is included in all of Lionel's current HO scale production train sets. This includes the Cajun Special, the Water Level Limited, the freight version of the Christmas Express, and of course the Polar Express and a few others. That said, this is not a complete criticism on my part, as this is a very well made locomotive, although a little bit big for beginners in the hobby to get on the tracks. We'll go more into that later when I rerail this unit. The detailing is decent enough, although most of it is molded into the plastic. The cab has a nice three-dimensional effect, which I'll show right here, where the instruments actually pop out and don't seem to be just simply sort of sketched into the plastic. It has weight and heft to it. It doesn't have traction tires, indicating it can more than hold its own hauling these cars. Overall, it's just a very nicely put together unit. Oh, did I mention again it has the Bluetooth system built in as well as DCC and sound from the factory? Yes, it's the same locomotive across all of the train sets. But that said, it's not a bad product, it works well and does its job. Moving on to the tender, it is yet again a partsman sort of, I guess, special, as it's basically the exact same tender included with the Water Level Route Limited. Now, unlike the Bachmann sets, which essentially have little more than an ornament that's drugged behind the locomotive to make it look realistic, this particular tender serves a purpose, housing the Bluetooth and DCC and sound equipment, as well as providing extra power to the locomotive via the metal wheels on the bottom via a special umbilical cable that plugs into the back of the locomotive. I'll show more of that in a while as we assemble the train. It also has heft to it, unlike most of those Bachmann tenders, and it really needs to in order to maintain the contact on the rails. We also note the speaker cutout on the base of it, which is where all the sound effects from the set emanate from, including the announcements, which I'll go into later. Now let's take a look at the coaches themselves. We'll start with the observation car. And once again, another mistake was made with this car, as the rear light is actually now yellow instead of red. Why? Who knows? At any rate, it essentially is, as we can clearly tell by looking at it, the end car from the Polar Express, just wearing a different shade of colors and or a different paint scheme. That paint scheme is, of course, the North Pole Central, which is the fictitious railroad that happens to operate apparently around the North Pole and what this train set is themed to. Gee, I wonder what big railroad inspired that from real life. Looking underneath it, there's plenty of underbody detail for what it is. The coach has heft to it and again has the metal wheels as well as metal sprung knuckle couplers to give it a more reliable ability in terms of having the cars staying fastened to each other. The windows, of course, have the silhouettes of various different Christmas characters who apparently are riding on the commuter train, apparently taking them back and forth to work every day. And the coach, again, is lit by LEDs and is flicker-free. Now let's look at one of the other coaches. Again, all these coaches delivered in this plastic wrap to protect them. Not much to be said here. Again, a little heft to it and weight to it, much like the other coach. Metal wheels, again, the wheel wipers on the axles to pick it up. Here's a better shot of the actual knuckle couplers on this particular coach. Really nothing to be said there. The coaches, again, have slightly different sort of silhouettes inside them, although it appears they're at least in part inspired by the New York Central Water Level Limited set that Lionel also sells. Overall, not much to be said here. Again, lit by LEDs, flicker-free, and typical Lionel quality, something you don't always get in train sets these days. The same can be said for the third coach, which is actually the first coach hooked up in order with this particular set, just because of the order I reviewed them. Again, it has the North Pole Central livery, which again appears to be green, red, and gold with gold trim, I should say. Nice underbody detail, nice weight to it, flicker-free lit, and again lit by LEDs. Metal wheels, metal sprung knuckle couplers. Next, last but not least, we'll look at the actual controller included with this set. Again, this is a Bluetooth controller designed to interface with the Bluetooth control system built into the actual tender of the locomotive. We'll go into more how to set that up later on. Nothing much to be said here. It feels high quality enough, fits nicely within the hand, features a button for the bell, a button for the announcements, and a button for the horn, as well as a throttle, which is that circular dial on the top. And again, pushing it toward the reverse section of the dial reverses the engine, and going forward does the same. Also note the, again, North Pole Central logo in the middle of the actual controller itself to remind you just what set this particular unit belongs to. I guess Lionel is expecting people to collect these. And now let's talk about the tracks included with this particular set. It's pretty much a requirement these days to have some kind of track with your train set that can simply be set up right on a carpet, and Lionel has its own called Magnematic track. While the track itself goes together easily, as we'll see, it has a flaw in that it doesn't hold itself together rigidly enough to avoid derailments with the trains. All this said, however, I have yet to find a single type of track designed to set up on a carpet that doesn't have some kind of flaw with it. Whether it's the easy track system and its tendency to wear out the annoying rail joiners, or lifelike with its highly reliable but very difficult to assemble and requiring the patience of a saint in some cases, power lock in terms of getting those tracks to lock together, although that is still my preference. Anyway, to demonstrate how these tracks go together, it's really quite simple. Place the tracks near each other and they simply snap right together. The magnets hold them in place, but as we can see, there is plenty of flex allowed for them. What I have noticed on this, the easier the track goes together, the more likely it is to come apart, and that seems to be again the case with this particular track. Taking a specific look at one of the curved sections here, we find it has some unusual quirks. To start with, the radius is not 18 inches, nor is it 22 inches. It's in fact 20 inches. It's not clear as to why Lionel chose this unusual radius for the curves. A good guess, though, is that they wanted the actual track layout to be compact, yet at the same time be able to accommodate the massive 284 locomotive and its turning abilities, which it definitely does require a lot of space to go around curves, and 18 inches just wouldn't cut it for that. At the same time, they didn't want to go for the 22-inch tracks, again, to keep the layout more compact, so this is the compromise the company came up with. Again, assembling these tracks is beyond easy. Simply get the tracks near each other where they join, and the tracks will literally attach themselves, as we'll see here. Again, the attachment point is not a very strong one, but it does the job to a certain extent. Just be forewarned, if you're setting this up on a carpet, that you're going to have to make frequent adjustments to avoid having bumps and or uneven surfaces in the track themselves. As we'll see, such even minor imperfections will cause the train to derail itself. We'll also note that some of the track sections are actually bent. It appears to have something to do with how they were shipped, although it could have been a manufacturing defect, not sure. At any rate, I will note that the tracks did function when I assembled everything, although not perfectly. And to avoid having anyone fall asleep, as this part of assembling the layout together is a bit on the tedious side and quite boring, I'm going to fast forward through the whole assembly process. With all the tracks assembled and our layout laid out, if you will, it's time to now talk about how to power it, and that's through this little transformer that comes with the set itself. Please note this is not the controller, it is just the power source for the tracks, and I'll show you how that goes in place. And as we see here, it literally just plugs right into the terminal track itself, similar to what Bachmann does, except this is a Bluetooth power source, not an actual speed controller. Next, after we connect it up, we see that the terminal light goes red, indicating that the track is now powered, and we can then proceed with the next phase, which is to get all the trains on the tracks. I wouldn't normally recommend energizing the tracks before you derail the train for the first time, especially if you're a beginner, but I'm not a beginner, and that's just the way I did it in this case. And we'll start with the big Berkshire locomotive itself. I still question why Lionel thinks this is a good idea to include with starter sets, as this engine is a real pain to get on the tracks, and that's coming from a model railroader with the nexus of 30 years of experience in the hobby. The inclusion of this locomotive is made especially interesting by the fact that this set does not include a derailleur. Whatever the case, after wrestling with it a bit and moving it back and forth, I finally do get it on the tracks, and it is all set to run. Now, before we actually derail the tender, we need to make sure the switch on the bottom of it is set to the proper mode we want to operate the train as. In this case, I'm going for Bluetooth, which translates into remote, so this top switch here must be set to such, and it is. The sound switch is optional, but I'm going to leave that on so I can do a thorough review on this item. Also, while we're down here, we can get a good shot of the speaker as well as the wheel wipers and pickups. With the locomotive now safely on the track, it's now time to derail the tender. Carefully place it onto the track, move it back and forth, and try to position the wheels on the rails. Obviously, you'll know it's on the track when you stop getting resistance and or the thumping noise from the ties hitting the wheels as you move it back and forth. Once you're sure the tender's on the track, connect the actual power cable from the locomotive to it, and be sure to be careful doing this, as this is the central umbilical cord, if you will, that sends all the signals from the actual DCC/Bluetooth controller from the locomotive to the tender and vice versa. It also allows the pickups from the tender to communicate with the locomotive. So if this gets damaged and or isn't connected correctly, it's going to cause you problems. As we'll see later on, in spite of my 30 years plus experience, even I struggled with this particular connection. Next, we'll hook the actual tender to the back of the locomotive. My advice is to use the actual furthest hole back on that actual hook to ensure that there is as much room as possible for the train to negotiate curves. Please note I did disconnect the cable when doing this so I could show how to do this correctly, as you really do want to hook this up. If you hang it by the wire, you can rip that wire out, which can be a big mess to fix. And with all of those items out of the way, it's now time to derail the train itself. We'll start with the first coach, going in order from the way they were put in the box. Again, line the wheels up, place them on the tracks, move it back and forth to ensure there's no resistance from the ties, and you'll know you're on the track. Position the couplers and gently push the car against the tender to lock it into place. Repeat this procedure for the rest of the train cars. With all the cars joined, it's time to set the locomotive up and give her a test run. Please note I had caught my previous mistake of connecting the power prematurely before actually putting the trains on the track, and unplugged it while I was doing so. Once I reconnect the power, as you see, all the coaches jump to life, and the tender responds by giving off its whistling and or chiming noise, indicating the DCC/Bluetooth system is looking for the Bluetooth command but can't detect it. To fix this problem, we simply are going to switch the Bluetooth command system on once I've installed the batteries. To install the batteries, we simply open the back compartment by removing a screw and then lift the compartment itself out of the way. Next, we get 3 AAA batteries and install them into the back of the unit itself so it can be self-powered. Again, this functions kind of like a remote control to a TV set, except in this case it's Bluetooth, so it is a much more reliable connection. Once we have all the batteries back in place, we simply replace the cover, tighten the screw back up, and we're all set to go. Next, we turn the remote on to stop the incessant chime from the locomotive. Please note the Bluetooth controllers come pre-paired with the locomotive from the factory, so you should just need to turn it on to stop the chime. Once the chime stops, we know we have control of the locomotive. We can try the features.
We're delivering Christmas cheer, enough to last throughout the year. Make way for Christmas cheer. Great job. Let's do some more. Make way for Christmas cheer. Great job. Let's do some more. Great job. Let's do some more.
The announcement choices for this particular train set are very interesting, considering the fact that this is supposed to be for adults only and not children. The assumption I have is that this is merely to try to bring back the kid and the adults that buy these sets, and or for the adults that run these sets for their kids, as children are not allowed to play with these anymore. And oh bah humbug, as you see here, the train is not responding to my commands. I couldn't figure out exactly what was going on, but after a little finagling I soon discovered what the problem was. Remember what I said about this plug giving me trouble despite my 30 years experience in the hobby? As it turns out, I hadn't had the cable properly connected, so the way of fixing it was to simply pull it apart and push it back in. This would then allow me to finally get control of the actual locomotive and make it run. That minor headache taken care of, I could now finally throttle the locomotive up and see how she ran. And again, for those of you out there who own a Lionel set similar to this one, you aren't hearing things. This is in fact got the same sound effects that those particular trains have as well. Essentially, again, this is the same locomotive. The main difference in the sound effects are just the announcements. At higher speeds, the engine sounds distinctly more like a fire engine than it does a locomotive. Incidentally, the steam chuff is actually triggered at the speed of the actual tender wheels turning, not an actual pre-recorded sound for that particular speed. Kind of unusual, but I guess this is a cost-cutting measure required to get the train down to the price it was sold for. As you can see by these pictures, unlike the locomotive included in the Chassis System Special set, which was also a steam set by Bachmann, this locomotive really looks refined as it rolls along. The side rods move very smoothly, the engine doesn't rock and roll. It really looks substantial and well built. Something I could not say again for the Bachmann, unfortunately. As we can also see, some of the tracks showed up pretty badly bent. It was still usable, but still a bit of a quality blemish there for Lionel. We also note that the LED headlight on this locomotive is very clearly visible and does cast a beam out in front of the locomotive. We also note that the LED headlight on this locomotive is very clearly visible and does cast a beam out in front of the locomotive. Remember what I said about this track not being held together rigidly? You can also now visualize what I mentioned before. Essentially, the sound effects stop when the locomotive's physical motion stops, and it has nothing to do with the physical throttle setting for it. Getting the locomotive to run slow was a bit of a challenge. Again, some of those tracks weren't in the greatest of shape, causing it to jump the track slightly when I even tried to do these slow runs. But after a little persistence, I was able to get something resembling a smooth run out of the engine.
Why it's a DVD of the Polar Express?
Now let's see how this locomotive handles a crawl. Again, I'm running the Bluetooth system, so I'm going to take its settings at full face value, as I have no way of adjusting them, and also to give those watching this video a true perspective of what it would be like to own this locomotive and train set out of the box. While I have seen slower crawls, it is very, very smooth. Noticeably smoother than the Bachmann steam locomotive included with the Chessie special train set that I tested more recently. the slow crawl testing out of the way, let's take a good look at this locomotive. Again, this is Lionel's standard, if you will, 284 type Berkshire locomotive. It puts in all of its HO gauge train sets, nicely decked out in this case in green and red paint, as well as white trim. Again, we note the North Pole Central lines. Again, it's very clear that there's a certain major railroad that inspired that particular road name. Taking a shot of the top of the smokestack and inside the smokestack, we see there is no smoke generator in this locomotive whatsoever, although then again the previous train set I reviewed, the Bachmann set, didn't have one either. There isn't very much to be said again about the detailing here. It's pretty much all there, except it's usually molded into the plastic and or edged into the plastic. It certainly is better than what Bachmann was able to put together on the chassis special, but that said, there isn't anything here that will grab you and say, oh wow, I've got to have one of these, except maybe the extremely sharp and vibrant paint. The front of the engine, well, the bell, as I mentioned before, is posable. You can actually move it back and forth. Not sure why someone would want to do that unless they want to pose this for a still shot. Again, it has the pilot lights in the front here, the classification lights, which are perpetually green, and of course a headlight. Please note that those pilot lights do not actually illuminate. Moving on to the cab interior, it definitely has a 3D effect about it. The parts do seem to pop out of the actual surface of the cab itself. Again, they're not separately applied, and I have seen better cabs, but this is certainly very decently done for what this locomotive is, especially considering the Bachmann with its etched-in plastic detailing that didn't stick out whatsoever. Underneath the locomotive, it's typical Lionel quality. Note the two rear wheels, and I forgot to note this before, are actually traction tire equipped. The others are all basically standard driving wheels, nickel silver again for pickup. There are also two more nickel silver type wheels underneath the cab to support it, or firebox I should say, to support it, and two wheels underneath the actual pilot, again nickel silver, both hinged in and both very well done. We also see the hook I mentioned before, which is used to join the locomotive to the actual tender. From the front we get a good look at the LED light, which again casts a very bright light out in front of the locomotive, which is definitely more believable than the Bachmann's, where you could barely tell it was on, let alone illuminating anything. The paint again looks sharp, the details are all in place. Really nothing much more to be said about that, except again the details all seem to be unfortunately molded into the plastic, but again that was done to keep the price down for obvious reasons. Over here we have the operating book for the train set itself, but it's mostly about the locomotive where most of the maintenance will occur. And again, here's a shot of the disclaimer that this set is not designed for people under the age of 14 years. As you can see, the manual is very detailed and very complete, showing every little detail from how to join the tracks, like I showed before, as well as connect the power, operate the train, and of course how to lubricate and maintain the locomotive. There's also a section on how to adjust the actual tender of the locomotive itself, as again this is how you select whether the locomotive has sound or not, or runs on the actual Bluetooth or DCC commands. The guide provides very detailed information on the lubrication points of the wheels specifically on this locomotive. I do believe this particular locomotive has bearings on it, although I've heard mixed things. So I've heard somewhere it did, I've heard somewhere it doesn't. Whatever the case, this is an area where you don't want to mess around. It's a good idea again to lube bearings that are making contact and or conducting power with conductive lubricant, not oil. Just a quick note on that. It even goes into how to set the throttle for speed controls and all the functions of the actual app itself if you were to download the app and use that to control the train, which again is another option available to you. And now we come to this part in my review where I discuss the price of the product in question. In this case, it's, well, a bit on the steep side, admittedly, $359.99. Now, admittedly, inflation is causing prices to go up, and admittedly, you can find it cheaper. Mine came from Amazon, where I paid about $276 for it at that time, although even that price has gone up. Now I see it listed as $299 on Amazon. All that said, while this was a little bit more expensive, at least in full retail, than the Bachmann Chassis System Special that I had, I believe they called that train set, which was $285, I think it is worth that extra money. Remember, that set didn't have metal wheels, it didn't have the metal sprung couplers or any of the other details this locomotive has, nor did it have as well weighted and as well produced cars as this particular set has. On top of that, this set also adds the very, very much appreciated DCC and sound from the factory as well as Bluetooth control, all again included for that price. Bottom line, for the price and for what this is, it certainly is a worthy buy. Just to be forewarned, you're not getting much different, as essentially this is the equivalent of going to a GM dealer and buying a Buick instead of a Chevy, or back in the day a Pontiac instead of a Buick, or Oldsmobile instead of a Buick. You get the idea. It's platform engineering at its best. Luckily, the underpinnings of this set justify the fact that it does have a higher price, as they are built to a standard. Bottom line, this set is a solid buy. And that's going to do it for this review. If you liked it, thumbs up and subscribe, as it helps me greatly. If you didn't, please feel free to thumbs down it. Please also feel free to comment on the video if there's anything you'd like me to show in future videos, and or if you have comments about this video, etc. And as always, keep the metal side down.